The rain fell the way it always did in Hargrove Hill, not in polite sheets or gentle curtains, but in a furious, relentless assault, as though the sky had a personal grievance with the city below. Thunder cracked low and close over the ridge, and in the blue-white flashes of lightning, the stone facade of Vance Manor looked less like a home and more like a fortress that had simply grown tired of pretending otherwise. The convoy of black vehicles arrived at 11:47 p.m. Elias Vance stepped out of the lead car without waiting for his driver to open the door. He never waited for anything. That particular habit had been beaten into him, along with several others, in a place far from this hilltop, in a life he had spent 20 years burying under steel and concrete and the kind of cold, meticulous success that left no room for sentiment. He was 35 years old, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark charcoal suit that had cost more than most people made in a month. His face was the face of a man who had learned, very early, that softness was a liability. The merger had been brutal. 14 hours of negotiations. 2 CEOs reduced to stuttering men across a conference table. One company dismantled and folded into the ever-expanding structure of Vance Corp with the quiet, inexorable efficiency of a glacier consuming a valley. His chief of staff, Marcus, had called it a masterpiece. Elias had called it Tuesday. He bypassed the main entrance out of habit, the kind of deeply ingrained wariness that came not from wealth but from something older, and went around to the kitchen entrance at the rear of the manor. It was a habit his head of security, a former Marine named Doyle, had long since stopped questioning. Doyle was behind him now, 2 steps back, one hand resting with professional ease near the firearm beneath his jacket. Elias pushed open the door. The kitchen was dark. The motion sensors should have activated the lights, but the storm had tripped the backup relay again. He reached for the wall panel, flooding the room in cool overhead light. That was when Doyle's hand moved to his weapon. Something shifted beneath the far kitchen island, a shadow within shadows, small and hunched and utterly still, pressed into the corner where the cabinet met the wall beneath the bar counter. The kind of stillness that wasn't calm, the kind that was desperate. "Don't," Elias said quietly. Doyle's hand stopped. Elias walked forward alone. His footsteps were deliberate, unhurried. He crouched down at a distance of several feet, letting the ceiling light fall past him rather than casting his shadow over whatever was beneath that counter, and he waited. Lightning strobed through the kitchen windows. In that fractured half-second of light, he saw her. She was perhaps 8 years old, though she was so small and so painfully thin that she might have been 6. She wore a boy's t-shirt, 3 sizes too large, the kind sold in bulk from discount bins, printed with the faded logo of a baseball team. It was soaked through. Her feet were bare on the cold tile, and her hair was plastered dark and flat against her forehead and cheeks. But it was her hands that stopped the breath in Elias Vance's chest. She was clutching a kitchen dishcloth, not one of the decorative linens that the household staff kept folded by the sink, but a gray utility cloth, old and slightly stiff, the kind used for scrubbing. She was pressing it against her chest with both hands, the way a drowning person holds a rope. And across both of those small hands, across the knuckles, the palms, the webbing between her fingers, were the marks of sustained, methodical damage. Cracked skin, raw, weeping fissures, the distinctive, chemical-pale discoloration along her wrists and the back of her hands that came not from a single accident, but from prolonged immersion in industrial cleaning agents. And beneath that, older marks, linear marks, precise and terrible in their regularity, running in faint parallel lines across her forearms. She looked up at him. Her eyes were gray, and they were not the eyes of a child who had been surprised or frightened in the normal way that children are frightened. They were the eyes of something much older wearing a child's face, watchful, calculating the distance to the door, assessing threat and exit simultaneously with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years. Then she did the thing that broke something in Elias Vance that had not been broken since he was 15 years old. She tightened her grip on the dishcloth, pulling it closer, pressing it harder against her chest, and she did not beg him not to hurt her. She did not cry. She did not scream. She offered him a deal. "I can wash dishes," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, and it trembled at the edges, but it held. "All of them. Every single one. I'm very good at it. I won't break anything." She swallowed. Her throat moved visibly with the effort. "Please, sir." Please just hide me. Don't let them find me. That's all I want. I'll wash every dish in your whole house. I promise I will." The kitchen was completely silent except for the rain hammering the windows. Doyle, behind him, said nothing. Elias said nothing for a long moment. He was looking at the dishcloth in her hands, at the specific, practiced way she held it, like armor, like a credential, like proof of something. He had held things like that before. Not dishcloths, a mop handle, a bucket, whatever was in reach when you needed to prove that you were useful, that you had value, that there was a reason to keep you. He had been 11 the first time he'd said words almost exactly like hers. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Lily. Lily." He kept his voice level, neutral, the way you spoke to a bird that had landed on a windowsill. "Who are you hiding from, Lily?" She shook her head. Not a refusal, exactly, but something instinctive. The reflex of someone who had learned that answering that question led to bad things. "Okay," he said simply. "You don't have to tell me tonight." He stood up slowly, making no sudden movements, and turned to Doyle. "Call Dr. Thorne." Doyle blinked. "Sir, it's almost midnight. I'm aware of the time." His voice was quiet, but it had the particular quality that ended conversations. "Call her." He turned back to the kitchen, opened a cabinet, and took down a clean glass. He filled it with water from the filtered tap and set it on the floor, not on the counter, not extended toward her, but simply set it down in the open space between them, within her reach when she was ready. Then he sat down on the kitchen floor, his back against the opposite counter, his expensive suit jacket creasing across the shoulders, and he waited. It took 11 minutes. Then a small hand reached out from under the counter and took the glass. Clara Thorne arrived at 12:23 a.m., driving herself because her driver had the night off and she hadn't waited for Elias's car service. She was 28, and she had been working for Vance Corp as its chief legal counsel for 3 years, a title that encompassed considerably more than contract review. She was also the person Elias called when a situation required a different kind of damage assessment. Her dual qualifications in family law and clinical child psychology had initially struck the legal community as an eccentric combination. In practice, they made her extraordinarily good at her job. She came in through the same rear entrance, umbrella already collapsed and dripping, and stopped. Elias Vance, the man who had once conducted a board meeting from a hospital room 3 hours after an emergency appendectomy without mentioning the appendectomy, was sitting on the floor of his kitchen in a $2,000 suit, leaning against the counter with his arms resting loosely on his knees, and pressed against his left side. Having migrated there at some point in the past 20 minutes through some small, gradual renegotiation of safe distances, was a tiny girl who had fallen asleep clutching a gray dishcloth. Clara stood in the doorway and did not move for a full 5 seconds. Then she set down her bag very quietly and crossed to them, crouching on the girl's other side. She took in the hands first, because that was what you looked at when you knew what to look for. The cracked skin, the chemical burns, the disciplinary marks on the arms. She looked up at Elias. His jaw was very tight. There were things moving in his expression that she had never seen there before, things she suspected he was not entirely aware of, and she made a private note of them and looked away. "How long has she been asleep?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a murmur. "About 15 minutes. Does she have a name?" "Lily." He paused. "That's all I have." Clara looked at the girl's hands again. Then she reached into her bag, which she had thought to pack with clinical efficiency before leaving her apartment, and withdrew a small first aid kit. "I'll need better light," she said. "I know. And I'll need you to stay very calm when she wakes up," Clara added, not looking at him. There was a silence. "I'm always calm," Elias said. Clara glanced at his hands. His knuckles had been white since she'd walked in. "Of course you are," she said evenly. They worked in quiet tandem for the next hour, Clara cleaning and bandaging the wounds on Lily's hands with the painstaking care of someone who understood that even the gentleness of treatment could be re-traumatizing if not done right, and Elias staying exactly where he was, a point of unmoving stillness, because somewhere in the pragmatic machinery of his mind, he had understood without being told that the child had chosen his proximity and that removing it abruptly would be a cruelty. Clara worked. The rain drummed on. When she finally sat back on her heels and looked at the full catalog of what she had found, the chemical burns, the old welts, the malnutrition evident in the sharpness of the child's wrists and collarbones, she felt the controlled, professional surface of her composure stretched thin over something hard and furious underneath. She looked at Elias again. This time he was looking directly at her, and whatever she saw in his face made her very glad, for the first time, that she was not the person who had done this to this child. "We're going to need to talk," she said quietly. "Tomorrow," he said, after she slept. Clara nodded. She pulled a soft blanket from the basket near the kitchen hearth. The housekeeper kept them there for cold evenings and draped it carefully around Lily's shoulders without waking her. Lily's small hand, bandaged now and clean, tightened reflexively around the dishcloth even in sleep. Neither of them spoke about that. Lily woke at 6:14 in the morning. She had been moved to one of the guest rooms during the night, carried there by Elias with the focused care of someone handling something irreplaceable, while Clara walked ahead and turned down the bed and kept the lights low. The room was larger than the laundry facility she had lived and worked in for the past 11 months, which was not a comparison she made with any particular emotion. She simply cataloged it, the way she cataloged everything: exits, furniture, the weight and position of things that could be useful. She lay still for exactly 3 seconds after opening her eyes. Then she sat up, swung her legs over the edge of the bed, and looked for something to clean. The room was already immaculate. That slowed her, briefly, but she adapted quickly. She smoothed the blanket. She straightened the pillow. She moved to the adjoining bathroom and found a hand towel slightly askew on its rail and folded it precisely. She was on her way to the hallway when the door opened. Clara was standing there with 2 mugs of tea and the particular expression of someone who had been awake for a while and had been quietly waiting without making it obvious. She was in a soft gray sweater now rather than the clothes she'd arrived in, which meant she had stayed the night. Lily froze. The instinct was reflexive, the full-body stillness of a child who had learned that being caught in motion often preceded punishment, regardless of the reason for the motion. "Good morning," Clara said, in the same tone she might have used to note mild weather. She held out one of the mugs. "It's chamomile, with honey, if that's all right." Lily looked at the mug, then at Clara, then at the mug again. "I made the bed," Lily said. Her voice had the careful flatness of a prepared defense. "And I straightened the bathroom. I can do the rest of the rooms if you show me where the cleaning things are." "I appreciate that," Clara said pleasantly. "But it can wait. Come sit down. I don't want to be any trouble." "You're not." "I can be useful," Lily said, and there was something very small and very fierce underneath the words, like a candle burning at the center of a cold room. "I work very hard. I don't complain. I eat very little, less than you'd think for my size." "I won't," she stopped, swallowed. Her chin lifted fractionally, the way it had the night before, that strange, heartbreaking dignity. "Please, I'll be good. I promise I'll be so good." Clara set both mugs down on the dresser. She crossed the room and sat down on the edge of the bed, at Lily's height. She did not crowd her. She did not reach for her. "Lily," she said quietly, "you don't have to earn your place here. Do you understand what that means?" Lily stared at her. "It means," Clara continued, "that your being here isn't a transaction. You don't owe anyone dishes or cleaning or anything else. You're allowed to just be here. You're allowed to sit and drink chamomile tea and not be useful for a little while." Something moved behind Lily's gray eyes. Not belief. It was far too early for belief, but the cautious, reluctant stirring of something that wanted to believe. "The man," Lily said. "The one from last night. Is he going to be angry that I'm still here?" "No." "Are you sure?" "Very." Lily seemed to weigh this for a long, private moment. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed next to Clara, not close, but close enough, and accepted the mug of chamomile tea. She held it in both hands, the bandages on her palms white and neat in the morning light, and she looked down at it. "It's warm," she said, very quietly, and it was not a complex statement, but there was something in her voice that suggested warm was a thing she had not had much recent experience with. Outside in the hallway, Elias stood with his back against the wall. He was not eavesdropping, exactly. He had simply arrived at the doorway at an inopportune moment and found he could not make himself leave. He had not slept. He had spent the remaining hours of the night in his study, not working, which was sufficiently unusual that Marcus, who monitored his email response times with the dedication of a cardiologist watching a monitor, had sent a careful inquiry at 5 a.m. But sitting in the dark with a glass of whiskey he didn't drink and the memory of 2 sets of marks on a child's wrists arranging and rearranging themselves in his mind. He heard Lily say it's warm, and he turned and walked away down the hall because there was a constriction in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time, and he needed a moment where no one could see his face. He went to his office. He stood at the window, looking out at the rain-washed grounds, the slate sky, the gardens that his housekeeper maintained, and that he walked through approximately never. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. Then he took out his phone and called Marcus. "I need everything you can find," he said, without preamble, "on a family or organization operating foster care or group homes in the Caldwell district. Prioritize laundry businesses, cleaning services, any operation that might have child welfare licensing." A pause. Then, "What are we looking for, sir?" "I'll know it when you find it," Elias said. "I want a preliminary report in 3 hours." He ended the call. He stayed at the window for a moment longer. The sun was attempting something modest behind the clouds, casting a thin, uncertain light across the wet stones of the garden path. By mid-morning, Lily had been coaxed into eating a scrambled egg, a piece of toast, a small cup of orange juice that she drank in tiny, deliberate sips as though rationing herself against future scarcity. She sat at the kitchen table in a borrowed sweater that came to her knees, her feet in thick wool socks provided by Elias's housekeeper, Mrs. Devereux, who had taken one look at the child's bandaged hands over breakfast and had said nothing at all, in the highly expressive manner of someone with a great deal to say. Elias came in from the hallway and stopped. He was not practiced at this kind of thing. He was practiced at boardrooms, at leverage, at identifying the precise structural weakness in an opponent's position and applying force at exactly the right angle. Children were not his domain. Lily looked up at him. He looked back. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, sir." She put her juice down and straightened very slightly in her chair. "I want you to know that I tidied the guest room this morning. The bathroom, too. Mrs. Devereux showed me where the linen closet is, and Lily." His voice was not sharp. It was simply quiet in the way that his voice was always quiet, but without the coldness that his staff associated with it. Something slightly different. Something that Clara, watching from across the kitchen, cataloged with care. Lily stopped talking. Elias crossed the kitchen and, after a moment of visible deliberation, the kind of internal calculation that Clara suspected he applied to everything, he crouched down beside her chair. He was tall, and at his full height, he cut an imposing figure, and he seemed to understand this, because he came down to her level with the same deliberate conscientiousness he'd shown the night before. "You don't have to do those things," he said. "You don't have to tidy rooms, or wash dishes, or be useful to anyone in this house. You understand." Lily looked at him with the careful, measuring look of a child who had learned that adults frequently said things they did not mean. "But then why would you keep me?" The question was not defiant. It was entirely sincere. A practical inquiry from someone who had constructed their entire model of human interaction around the economy of labor and necessity. Something moved in Elias's face. Clara saw it, and she looked away, because it was private. He reached out, slowly, telegraphing the movement, and placed one large hand very gently on the top of Lily's head. "Because you matter," he said. "Not because of what you can do. Just because you're here, and you're safe, and that's enough." Lily stared at him. Her lower lip moved, just slightly, a micro-tremor quickly suppressed, and then she pressed both bandaged hands flat on the table and looked down at them with the rigid concentration of someone fighting very hard to keep something inside. She didn't cry. She had not, Clara noted, cried once. "Okay," Lily said, very quietly. And then, after another moment, "Thank you, sir." "Elias," he said. She looked up. "My name is Elias. You can call me that, if you want." She seemed to consider this for a long time, as though accepting his name was a much larger concession than he probably realized. Then she said, "Okay, Elias." He stood up. He cleared his throat. He turned to the counter, and Clara watched him pour himself a cup of coffee with the slightly over-controlled precision of a man who had been more affected by the last 30 seconds than he would ever, under any circumstances, admit aloud. She handed him a spoon without comment. He took it without comment. Mrs. Devereux moved quietly between them, refilling Lily's juice glass, and for a moment the kitchen was full of the kind of ordinary, unremarkable domestic warmth that none of the three adults present, for very different reasons, were particularly accustomed to. Lily drank her juice. Outside, for the first time in 2 days, the rain began to ease. By the 4th day, Clara had a file. It was not yet a complete file. It was 17 pages of meticulous, cross-reference documentation, supplemented by Elias's preliminary investigative report, augmented by 3 phone calls Clara had made to colleagues in the city's child welfare system, and structured with the crisp, purposeful architecture of someone who had spent a decade learning exactly how to dismantle people in courtrooms. She spread it across the long table in the Manners study and walked Elias through it while Lily was in the sunroom with Mrs. Devereux, who had appointed herself the child's temporary companion with the quiet authority of someone who had been waiting her entire career for exactly this assignment. Arthur and Martha Grieve. On paper, pillars of the Hargrove Hill community. The Grieve Family Charitable Trust, founded 14 years ago, licensed to operate 3 group foster homes and 2 halfway houses for transitioning youth. Beneficiaries of over $800,000 in combined federal and state welfare subsidies over the last decade. Regular fixtures at the annual Hargrove Charity Gala. Martha Grieve sat on the board of the city's Child Welfare Advisory Committee. A photograph in the file showed them at last year's gala. Arthur Grieve in a well-cut suit, silver-haired and avuncular, the kind of face that sat easily in newspaper society pages. Martha Grieve in pearls, smile broad and certain. Their primary income, Clara said, doesn't come from the charitable trust. It comes from Grieve Clean Solutions, a commercial laundry and cleaning service that contracts with 4 major hotel chains and a dozen restaurants in the metro area. The company has grown 34% in the last 3 years. She paused. Their operating costs, however, have remained essentially flat. Labor, Elias said. Labor, she confirmed. The children in their care are registered as doing supervised vocational training as part of their rehabilitation programming. The licensing board considers it an educational initiative. Her voice was measured, but there was a quality beneath it, controlled, compressed, that Elias recognized. He had that quality himself, sometimes. He was looking at the file, but he wasn't reading it anymore. He was looking at a photograph Clara had printed, a partial image, captured from a city permit inspection photo, showing the interior of one of the Grieve laundry facilities. The industrial sinks were deep and stainless steel. The chemicals listed on the safety placard mounted on the wall included industrial-grade caustic cleaners. The chemical burns on her hands, he said, consistent with prolonged exposure to commercial-grade sodium hydroxide solutions, probably daily for at least 8 to 10 months. Clara kept her voice clinical, because clinical was the only way she could say it out loud. The linear marks on her forearms are consistent with disciplinary use of a switch or thin rod. There are also older healed fractures in her left hand, metacarpal, likely 6 to 8 months ago, which she almost certainly received and continued working through without medical treatment. The study was very quiet. Elias looked at the photograph of the Grieves. Clara had seen Elias Vance in a great many professional situations over the past 3 years. She had seen him in depositions, across boardroom tables, in the particular airless stillness of high-stakes negotiations. She had a comprehensive mental catalog of his expressions, assembled the way you assembled a tool kit, for reference, for anticipation. She had never seen this one before. It was not anger exactly. It was something colder than anger, something that lived below anger, at a depth where temperature inverted and cold became a kind of scorching. His face was completely still. His eyes were the color of deep water. "They've noticed she's gone," she continued, "because the information needed to be said. I've had word from a contact in the Caldwell District Police Liaison Office. A missing person inquiry was filed for a minor. Description matches Lily, filed by a registered foster guardian." She set another page on top of the pile. The inquiry was filed by the Grieve Family Charitable Trust. Who takes their calls at the police liaison office? Lieutenant Dermot Hale, who received a $10,000 consulting fee from a subsidiary of Grieve Clean Solutions 18 months ago. Clara let that sit for a moment, which I can also document. Elias was silent. "They will escalate," Clara said, "when the official channel doesn't produce results. They'll use other resources. They have enough money and enough practiced respectability to be dangerous when cornered." "I know, Elias. She waited until he looked at her. "We should take this to the district attorney. We have enough for—" "No." The word was quiet and completely final. "Not yet." Clara studied him. "If you're thinking of handling this in a way that—" "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "of handling this in a way that means they never, in the rest of their lives, have the resources, the reputation, the influence, or the freedom to do this to another child." He looked back at the photograph. "A criminal filing moves at the pace of the system, and the system can be bought. I'm going to make sure that by the time it reaches a courtroom, there is nothing left to buy with." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about objecting, on procedural grounds, on legal grounds, on the grounds that the orderly machinery of justice was supposed to be the point. She had spent a decade believing that very firmly. She looked at the photograph of Lily's hands in her clinical intake notes, which she had taken on the first morning and which she kept in this file for exactly the reason that documentation was protection. "What do you need from me?" she said. Something shifted in his expression. Brief, barely perceptible. "Everything you can legally obtain. Every financial record, every licensing document, every inspection report, every transaction that connects the Grieve homes to the cleaning company. I want it airtight." He paused. "And I want you to look after Lily." "I'm already looking after Lily." "I know," he said. "I'm asking you to not stop." It was, for Elias Vance, an unusually direct request. Clara recognized it as such, which meant she also recognized what it cost him to make it. "I won't stop," she said simply. The Grieves, meanwhile, had become significantly less composed. In the 3 days since Lily's disappearance, Arthur Grieve had made 11 phone calls to Lieutenant Hale, raised the reward for information regarding the runaway to $5,000 in cash, and had begun making discreet inquiries through channels that did not appear in any official ledger. Martha Grieve had submitted a second missing person report to a different city office with annotations about the child's fragile mental state and tendency toward self-harm, framing designed to pathologize and discredit the kind of narrative architecture erected by people who had done this before and knew which structures held weight. They were, in other words, beginning to be afraid. They were right to be. They simply did not yet understand of whom. The Hargrove Hill Autumn Charity Gala was held on a Thursday evening in the Grand Ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, 20 stories of gleaming glass and marble in the heart of the city's financial district, overlooking the harbor. Tables at the event cost $12,000. Arthur Grieve had purchased 3. The evening's charitable beneficiary was, with a staggering lack of irony, the city's Child Welfare Endowment Fund. By 8 p.m., the ballroom was full. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light over 500 of Hargrove Hill's most well-dressed citizens. The Grieves stood near the central bar, Arthur working the room with the practiced ease of long cultivation, Martha accepting compliments on the centerpieces she had personally selected. They were, to all outward appearances, exactly what they had always appeared to be. At 8:23 p.m., the lights went out. Not all the lights, just the main chandelier arrays. A moment of polite consternation rippled through the crowd. Then the enormous projection screen at the far end of the ballroom, intended for the evening's charity presentation, flickered to life. What appeared on it was not the charity presentation. It was a spreadsheet. Clean, precise, forensically organized. Column headings, date, transaction, source account, beneficiary, amount, 14 months of financial transfers, moving money between the Grieve Family Charitable Trust, the Grieve Clean Solutions payroll accounts, and a series of shell entities with names that meant nothing to most people in the room, but would mean a great deal to the Federal Trade Commission and the IRS. The room was very quiet. $847,000, said a voice from the back of the ballroom. People turned. Elias Vance was standing at the rear of the room in a black suit. He was not carrying anything. He didn't need to. He had the quality, in certain moments, of a force of nature that had simply stopped moving temporarily, the eerie, loaded stillness of the seconds before lightning. That is the amount of public money, he continued, walking slowly forward through the parting crowd, his voice carrying without effort in the crystalline silence, that Arthur and Martha Grieve have diverted from child welfare services into their private commercial enterprises over the last 14 years. Through falsified licensing documents, fraudulent subsidy claims, and, most relevantly, the unlicensed commercial exploitation of children in their legal care. Arthur Greaves' color had changed dramatically. "This is," he started. "Slide 2, Elias said. The screen changed. Medical documentation, photographs, clinical notes, the kind of records that existed in Clara's file and which had been obtained with scrupulous legal care, precisely because they would need to be used in exactly this way. The room's silence acquired a different quality. The polished social composure of 500 wealthy people fractured along very visible lines. Martha Grieve took a step backward. Slide 3. Personnel records from the Grieve foster homes, cross-referenced with Grieve Clean Solutions staffing logs, demonstrating the systematic assignment of minors as unpaid labor on commercial cleaning contracts. 17 children over 6 years. Hours worked. Documented injuries unreported to licensing authorities. 3 hospitalizations attributed by the Grieves to accidents that the medical records, when properly examined, told a different story about. The documentation on this screen, Elias said, reaching the front of the room now, standing 20 feet from Arthur Grieve with the particular, unhurried quality of someone who does not need to rush because the outcome has already been determined, has been simultaneously submitted to the District Attorney's Office, the Federal Bureau of Child Welfare Oversight, the State Licensing Authority for Foster Care Facilities, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and 6 journalists from publications whose editors are personal acquaintances of mine. He paused. The press embargo lifts at 9 p.m. He checked his watch. 37 minutes from now. Arthur Grieves' mouth was open. He had the look of a man who had stepped onto what he believed to be solid ground and found it to be the surface of a deep and lightless lake. "You can't," he started. "I also purchased your debt," Elias said. "All of it. The loans on the laundry facilities, the mortgage on the foundation building, the line of credit that your commercial operations run on. I purchased those instruments this afternoon from the respective lenders at a premium that they found it very easy to accept." He reached into his jacket pocket. He withdrew something and set it on the nearest table. It was a gray utility dishcloth. Old, slightly stiff, the kind used for industrial scrubbing. Every person in the room stared at it. "A child came to my home 11 days ago," Elias said, and something had changed in his voice. Not louder, not harder, but deeper, as though something that had been under pressure for a long time had found, finally, the precise seam through which to release it. "She was 8 years old. She was standing in my kitchen in the middle of the night, barefoot, soaking wet, with chemical burns on both of her hands and disciplinary scars on her arms. She was clutching a dishcloth. Because in the world you had constructed for her, the only way she knew how to ask for safety was to offer to be useful. The room was absolutely still. She told me she would wash all my dishes. Every single one. She promised she would eat very little and work very hard and not be any trouble." His voice was level, but it had the quality of something that had been refined down to its essential, irreducible truth. She was 8 years old, and she didn't know that she was allowed to simply exist without justifying her existence. Martha Grieve had begun to cry, a rapid, strategic kind of crying, the crying of someone accustomed to using distress as currency. It was not finding a market. "I want to be very precise," Elias continued, and now he looked directly at Arthur Grieve with the expression that Clara had catalogued from his study 11 days ago, that cold, deep, scorching thing that lived below anger. "About what happens next. Your accounts are frozen. Your assets are encumbered. Your licenses will be suspended within 48 hours pending the regulatory investigations that have already been initiated. Your board positions and charitable appointments will be withdrawn. I have already spoken with the relevant chairs. By this time tomorrow, you will have no operating capital, no institutional standing, and no political cover." He paused. "And at 9 p.m., you will have no reputation." Arthur Grieve looked around the room, at the faces of the people he had cultivated for decades, the dinners attended and donations made and favors exchanged, and found in them precisely nothing useful. The lieutenant's investigation, as it turned out, had also been submitted to the Internal Affairs Division of the City Police Department, along with the documentation of the $10,000 consulting fee. Dermot Hale was, at this precise moment, being asked some difficult questions by people who outranked him considerably. Arthur Grieve took a step toward Elias. Listen to me. Whatever you think happened, we can discuss this. We can." "There is nothing to discuss," Elias said. His voice had returned to that complete quiet, that absolute zero. There is only what happens next. And what happens next is that you are arrested, tried, and convicted. Clara Thorne. You know her as Vance Corp's legal counsel, but she also holds a clinical psychology license and has been certified as a forensic expert in child abuse cases in 4 jurisdictions. Has prepared testimony that I am told by people who know these things is the most comprehensive documentation of systemic child exploitation they have ever seen presented in a civil proceeding. From across the room, Clara met his eyes briefly. She was standing near the back, near the door, in a charcoal blazer, with nothing in her hands. She had done her part over the preceding 11 days with the quiet, relentless precision of someone who genuinely loved the law and was very, very good at it. She gave him a small nod. He looked back at the Greaves. He reached out one more time to the table and picked up the dishcloth. 17 children, he said quietly, over 6 years. While you attended charity galas and collected community service awards and sat on advisory boards deciding the welfare of children. He looked at the cloth in his hand for a moment. Then he looked at Arthur Grieve, and something in his expression was without mercy in the way that only something born of genuine understanding can be without mercy. I know what it is to be a child who believes their only value is what they can do for the person who holds power over them. I know what that does to a person. He set the cloth back down on the table. I also know that some debts are not settled in dollars. He turned and walked toward the exit. Behind him, the screen held its precise, documented, unassailable evidence. At 9:02 p.m., 6 news alerts pushed simultaneously to the phones of everyone in the ballroom. The Greaves did not leave through the front door that evening. The sentencing was on a gray Tuesday in November, in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Hargrove Hall County Courthouse. Arthur Grieve received 22 years. Martha Grieve received 18. Their assets had already been liquidated through a civil proceeding initiated by the DA's office, in which Clara had served as the primary forensic witness, and the proceeds were designated for the establishment of a proper child welfare fund, one with genuine oversight, genuine accounting, and a board of directors whose composition Elias had taken, characteristically, an extensive personal interest in ensuring. Lieutenant Hale was separately indicted. There would be further proceedings. Clara stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing and tilted her face up toward the November sky, which was pale and cold and utterly clear. Elias came out a few minutes later and stood next to her without speaking for a moment. "It's done," she said. "The legal part," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. "The rest takes longer." I know. He did know. He had known for 20 years, without having the vocabulary for it, that certain kinds of damage don't resolve. They restructure, and what you build on top of them depends on what you have to build with. He'd had very little to build with for a long time. He had built anyway, with whatever was available, and the structure was functional and formidable and had cost him things that he had not, until 11 days ago in a kitchen during a rainstorm, allowed himself to fully account for. "She asked me something this morning," Clara said. "What?" "She asked if she could have a drawing class." Clara paused. Apparently Mrs. Devereux's granddaughter takes drawing classes and showed her a sketchbook, and she stopped. Her voice had a quality he was not accustomed to hearing in it. Not grief, exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that came from the distance between what is and what should always have been. She asked very carefully, very formally, the way she does. She said, "I know art class isn't a necessary thing, so if it's too much to ask, I understand." Elias was quiet. "She's been with us for 3 weeks," Clara said, "and she still prefaces every request with a disclaimer that she understands if the answer is no. I know. It's going to take a long time. I know that too." They stood on the courthouse steps in the cold air, both of them looking at nothing in particular, both of them thinking about the same thing. "I told her yes," Clara said, "to the drawing class." "Obviously," Elias said. Clara almost smiled. "You should tell her too. When we get home." He looked at her. "When we get home." She'd said it without apparent awareness of what she'd said, and she looked up now and registered his expression, and something shifted in hers. Not embarrassment, exactly, but a kind of careful, deliberate acknowledgement. "If that's all right," she added. He looked back at the pale November sky for a moment. "Yes," he said, "that's all right." The drawing class started on a Wednesday. The instructor was a young woman named Petra who had a studio in the Arts District and who had been personally vetted. which was perhaps more thorough a process than most art teachers experienced. She had been told, simply, that her student was a child who was working through some difficult things and would need patience and gentleness, and absolutely no pressure to produce results on any particular timeline. Petra had said, "That's just how I teach." Elias had looked at her for a long moment, and then said, "Good." The first class, Lily sat in front of a blank page for 40 minutes. She held the pencil. She looked at the page. She didn't draw anything. Petra sat at a nearby table and worked on her own sketch without comment or encouragement or any indication that 40 minutes of looking at a blank page was anything other than completely normal. At the end of the class, Lily drew a house. It was careful and precise in the way that everything Lily did was careful and precise. Straight lines, measured proportions, a window on each side of the door. It looked like a diagram more than a drawing. She brought it home and set it on the kitchen table. Elias looked at it for a long time. "This is excellent," he said, with the absolute sincerity of someone who was not in the habit of saying things he didn't mean. Lily looked at him. "It doesn't have anyone in it." "No," he agreed. She picked up the pencil she'd brought home in her jacket pocket and, with the tip of her tongue between her teeth in concentration, added 3 small figures in front of the door. Stick figures, the universal shorthand of childhood. A tall one on the left, a medium one on the right, a small one in the middle, holding both their hands. She put the pencil down and looked at what she'd drawn. Then she looked up at Elias. He was looking at the drawing with an expression that Clara, coming in from the hallway at that precise moment with a basket of laundry and stopping in the doorway, would catalog later as the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on his face. "That's us," Lily said. It was not a question. Elias cleared his throat. "Yes," he said, "that's us." The months moved the way months do when something is gradually, carefully, imperfectly healing, not in a straight line, not without backsliding, not without the occasional midnight when old fear came calling and had to be patiently, quietly turned away. Lily had good days and hard days. On the hard days, she still sometimes woke and lay rigid with the instinct to prove her usefulness before she was fully conscious. On those mornings, she would find Elias already in the kitchen. He was always awake before her, which she had begun to understand was not coincidence. And he would hand her a cup of warm cocoa without ceremony, and they would sit at the kitchen island together in the early quiet, and nobody required anything of anyone. The bandages came off. The skin healed slowly. The scars remained, faint, silvery. The topography of something survived, and Clara had explained to Lily, carefully and honestly, that the scars would always be there, and that they were not something to hide, that they were evidence of endurance, that having survived something hard was not the same as being defined by it. Lily had considered this for several days before saying, with a measured thoughtfulness that characterized everything she processed deeply, like a tree that grew around a fence. Clara had looked at her for a moment. "Exactly like that," she said. "Exactly." Spring came in stages, as it always did in Hargrove Hill, tentatively at first, then with gathering confidence, as though the season itself was being coaxed out of a long weariness by consistent warmth and the patient evidence that it was safe to bloom. The swing set had been installed in the South Garden on a Saturday in April, which was technically not something that Elias had been personally involved in negotiating except that he absolutely had. He had reviewed 3 different contractor proposals and had personally inspected the anchor fittings and had asked 6 follow-up questions about load-bearing specifications that had led his assistant to quietly inquire whether the CEO of Vance Corp was experiencing some kind of professional identity crisis. He was not. On the first Saturday after the installation, Clara came out into the garden with a tray, lemonade for herself, juice for Lily, and a coffee for Elias, which she set on the garden table before settling into a chair with the particularly content quality of someone who has nowhere else they need to be. In the middle of the garden, on the swing set, Lily was swinging. She had taken a while to get started. She'd examined it with the methodical caution she applied to new things, testing the chains, checking the seat, sitting on it, and pushing with her feet tentatively. Elias had stood nearby with his hands in his jacket pockets, offering nothing, waiting with a patience that Clara had learned was one of his least visible but most genuine qualities. Then Lily had started to swing, and gradually, incrementally, she had swung higher. And at some point, Clara noticed the exact moment because she had been quietly watching for it. Lily had stopped thinking about the swing and simply been on it. The calculating, watchful quality had gone out of her face and been replaced by something open and simple and unreservedly present. She laughed. It was not the careful, tentative expression of pleasure that Clara had become accustomed to from her, the small, controlled smiles, the muted satisfaction that had been the emotional equivalent of testing ground before putting weight on it. This was different. This was clear and bright and unguarded, the laugh of a child who had forgotten, for a full 30 seconds, to be afraid. Clara felt the sound land somewhere deep in her chest. She looked at Elias. He was standing at the edge of the garden path, still, watching Lily with that expression she had catalogued months ago, the unguarded one. It was on his face more often now, in increments, the way sunlight appears in stages as cloud cover moves. It still surprised him sometimes, she thought. He was still learning the language of it. He turned and found her already looking at him, and neither of them looked away. "Push me," Lily called from the swing. "Elias, push me higher." He turned back to her, and Clara watched his expression do something she had not quite seen it do before, something that might, in a person with a different history, have been instant and easy, but in him was clearly a deliberate, conscious choice that he made with the full weight of understanding of what it meant to choose it. He crossed the garden. He pushed her. Lily shrieked with delight. The sound carried across the garden and up through the spring air, a clean and specific kind of happiness, and Clara sat in her chair with her lemonade and felt something in her chest that she had no particular professional framework for and didn't need one. Between pushes, Lily twisted around on the swing and looked at them both with the gray eyes that had once held only calculation and assessment. "Can we do this again tomorrow?" she asked. "Yes," Elias said. "And the day after?" "Yes." She swung forward, then twisted back again, slightly more breathless. "Every week." "Every week," he said. "Every Saturday. Same time." He looked at Clara. "Unless Dr. Thorne has a prior engagement." "Dr. Thorne," Clara said, "is free every Saturday." Lily swung forward, craning her neck back to look at them both upside down, her hair blowing across her face, grinning with the uncomplicated, reckless joy of someone who has just, finally, let herself believe that this is permanent. "Good," she said, "because I decided something." "What did you decide?" Clara asked. Lily swung forward, then back, then forward again, gathering momentum in the particular enthusiastic way of children who have recently discovered that they are allowed to want things without immediately tempering the want with reasons it shouldn't be possible. "I decided," she said, slightly out of breath, "that you're my family." She did not ask. She did not preface it with a qualifier or apologize for the presumption. She said it in the forthright, declarative way of a child who has arrived at a conclusion through careful analysis and is confident in her results. Clara's throat tightened. "Come here for a second," Elias said. The swing slowed. Lily dragged her feet and came to a stop, looking up at him with the evaluating look that had, over months, softened significantly at the edges. He crouched down in front of her. "I decided the same thing," he said. His voice was level. It was also, Clara thought, the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. "About 2 days after you showed up in my kitchen. I just didn't know how to say it yet." Lily looked at him for a long moment. Then she got off the swing, and she put both arms around his neck, and she held on. Elias's arms came around her, carefully, firmly, the way he did everything when he was paying attention, and he pressed one hand against the back of her head, where her hair was warm from the April sun. Clara looked at them from across the garden and thought about a girl who had walked into a stranger's kitchen with bleeding hands and offered everything she had in exchange for the simplest thing in the world: to be hidden, to be safe, to be somewhere that no one could take her away from. She thought about a man who had learned, in a place far from here, that being useful was the only viable offer, and who had spent 20 years building a fortress against the memory of it, and who was currently sitting on the grass in his garden in a very expensive suit, holding a child who had decided he was her family. She thought about herself, and about all the carefully organized professional distance she had maintained for years, and about how entirely it had failed to survive the combined assault of these two people. She picked up her lemonade. She walked across the garden and sat down in the grass next to them. Lily, without extracting herself from Elias, reached out one hand and found Clara's and held it. Her palm was warm. The faint silver lines across it caught the light for a moment. Evidence of endurance, the topography of something survived. And then Lily turned her face up toward the sun and closed her eyes and simply existed in the warmth of it. No justification, no bargain offered, no apology for taking up space. Just a child and the sun and the two people who had found her and a garden full of April light. Somewhere across the city, in a gray institutional corridor that smelled of disinfectant and fluorescent lighting, two people with the last name Grieve were beginning the first day of the rest of their lives. Here, in the south garden of Vance Manor, a swing set creaked gently in the spring breeze. A girl laughed, a man who had not known, for 20 years, that he was still waiting to be found, let himself be found. And the sun came out completely and stayed.